Open the wardrobe. Go ahead. It is 1862, and the wardrobe belongs to a fashionable woman of the upper middle class in London, and every item inside it is beautiful, and some of them are capable of killing her, and she does not know which ones, because the law does not require anyone to tell her. The hat on the top shelf was shaped by a man who is slowly going insane from the mercury he inhales every day in a workshop with no ventilation. The green dress hanging in the center was dyed with a compound containing enough arsenic to poison everyone at the dinner party she is planning to wear it to. The crinoline beneath it is a cage of steel and cotton that could ignite from a candle flame and burn her alive in under 60 seconds. The corset will compress her organs. The stockings may contain a dye that will blister her skin. The cosmetics on the dressing table beside the wardrobe contain lead, mercury, and arsenic in concentrations that a modern toxicology lab would classify as hazardous waste. She will put all of this on. She will put it on because it is what a woman of her station wears, because it is what fashion requires, because it is beautiful, and because nobody in any position of authority has told her that the beauty is a delivery system for the chemistry of damage. She will get dressed the way she gets dressed every morning, item by item, layer by layer, and by the time she is finished, she will be wearing a wardrobe that is, measured by any standard we currently possess, a catalog of the ways that Victorian fashion found to harm the people it was supposed to adorn. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what was in each garment, what it did to the body wearing it, or the body making it, who knew, who profited, and why the most fashionable woman in any Victorian room was frequently also the most poisoned. This is Dreadful History Files, and the wardrobe is open. Start at the top. The hat. The phrase "mad as a hatter" did not originate as a whimsical expression invented by Lewis Carroll for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It originated as a description of an occupational disease so widespread among hat makers that it had become a recognizable public type, a figure of speech rooted in the observable reality of an entire workforce slowly losing its mind. The disease was called erethism mercurialis, and it was caused by mercury, because mercury was how hats were made. The process was called carroting. Animal pelts, typically rabbit, were brushed with a solution of mercuric nitrate, an orange-colored compound that separated the fur from the skin and caused the fibers to mat together into the smooth, stiff felt required for fashionable hats. The solution worked. It also released mercury vapor into the air of the workshop, and the workshops were small and poorly ventilated, and the hatters who worked in them inhaled that vapor every day for the duration of their careers, which were typically short because the mercury accumulated in their bodies, and the accumulation produced effects that the medical literature describes with a clinical specificity that reads more like horror than science. Tremors in the hands, then the arms, then the entire body. The condition was called the hatter's shakes, and it was visible enough that people who encountered a hatter on the street could identify his profession by the way his body moved. Personality changes followed. Irritability, anxiety so severe that social interaction became impossible, depression, paranoia, memory loss, slurred speech. The teeth loosened and fell out. The gums softened. The kidneys failed. The hatter, who had spent years producing the top hats and bowlers and felt bonnets that Victorian men and women wore as markers of respectability, was, by the end of his working life, a man whose body had been systematically dismantled by the material he worked with, and the material he worked with was the material that produced the hat that the woman standing in front of her wardrobe is about to place on her head. NIOSH, the U.S. National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, published a background document confirming that the Mad Hatter's behavior in Carroll's 1865 novel referred to a real industrial hazard. The hatter's erratic, agitated behavior in the classic story, the document stated, refers to chronic occupational exposure to mercury. The woman who wore the hat was not directly poisoned by it. The man who made the hat was. If you are watching Dreadful History Files for the first time, subscribe now, because the hat was the least dangerous thing in the wardrobe, and everything that follows is worse. Move down, the hair ornaments, the artificial flowers. On the 20th of November 1861, a 19-year-old woman named Matilda Shorer died in London. She had worked as an artificial flower maker, producing the decorative floral arrangements that Victorian women wore in their hair, pinned to their gowns, and arranged on their hats. Her job was to dust the leaves of the artificial flowers with a green powder to make them look natural. The green powder was copper arsenite. It contained arsenic. Matilda Schorer inhaled arsenic with every breath she took in the workshop. She ate it off her hands at every meal. It accumulated in her lungs, her liver, her stomach, and the tissues of her body, with a patience that the chemistry of chronic exposure does not accelerate for the convenience of diagnosis. In her final illness, she vomited green liquid. The whites of her eyes turned green. Her fingernails turned green. She told her doctor that everything she looked at was green. She died convulsing, with what the press described as an expression of great anxiety, foaming at the mouth, the nose, and the eyes. The surgeon who performed the post-mortem, James Thomas Paul, stated that the cause of death was acute inflammation of the mucous membrane of the stomach, produced by the inhalation of the arsenite of copper. Her lungs and liver were highly impregnated with the poison. Matilda Schorer was not the woman wearing the flowers. She was the woman making them. The woman who wore the flowers in her hair at the ball that evening did not develop acute arsenic poisoning because the exposure was brief and the contact was indirect. The woman who made the flowers did develop acute arsenic poisoning because the exposure was continuous, the contact was direct, and the workshop where she spent her days had no ventilation, no protective equipment, and no legal requirement to disclose to its workers what the green powder they were handling actually contained. Dr. August Hoffmann, a chemist, analyzed the arsenic content of Victorian fashion items and concluded that an average woman's floral headdress contained enough arsenic to poison 20 people. A single ball gown dyed with arsenical green, he calculated, could shed as much as 60 grains of arsenic powder in a single evening of dancing, more than 10 times a lethal dose. Now take the dress off the hanger, the green dress. Scheele's green was invented in 1775 by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who mixed sodium carbonate, arsenious oxide, and copper sulfate to produce a pigment of extraordinary vibrancy. Nothing else available in the 18th or 19th century produced green with that intensity, that saturation, that specific quality of luminous depth that made it irresistible to textile manufacturers, wallpaper producers, and the Victorian fashion industry. By the early 19th century, an improved version called Paris green or emerald green had expanded the palette, and the Victorians embraced it with an enthusiasm that the chemistry's toxicity did nothing to moderate. The green went on dresses, on gloves, on ribbons, on shoes, on bonnets, on artificial flowers, on wallpaper, on book covers, on children's toys, on candles, on confectionery. The color was everywhere, because the color was beautiful, and beauty was the currency the fashion system operated on, and the fashion system had not been designed to include the chemical composition of its materials as a variable worth examining. Punch magazine published a cartoon in 1862 titled The Arsenic Waltz, depicting skeletons dancing in green dresses, which was the kind of commentary that the press produced when the evidence of harm became too visible to ignore, and the editorial position was that the harm was worth noting without being worth legislating against. Britain would not regulate the use of arsenic in consumer goods until 1895, a full 34 years after Matilda Schorer's death, and long after France and Germany had already passed their own restrictions. The delay was not an accident of bureaucratic timing. It was the product of an industrial lobby that disputed the evidence, a consumer base that preferred the color to the caution, and a legislative system that had decided the deaths of working-class flower makers and the skin irritations of fashionable women were not sufficient grounds for interfering with commerce. Now the crinoline. Pull it out carefully. It is the most physically dangerous item in the wardrobe, and it killed without chemistry. It killed with physics. A crinoline was a cage. That is not a metaphor. It was a structure of steel hoops connected by fabric tapes, worn beneath the skirt, to produce the wide, bell-shaped silhouette that dominated women's fashion from the mid-1850s through the mid-1860s. It replaced the layers of heavy petticoats that had previously been required to achieve the same shape, which made it lighter and more comfortable in some respects, and catastrophically more dangerous in one very specific respect. A crinoline was a cage of steel and cotton that enclosed the lower half of a woman's body in a structure that was open at the bottom, which meant that an updraft from a fireplace, a gust of wind near a candle, or a stray spark from a coal fire could enter the cage from below and ignite the fabric layers from the inside, producing a fire that surrounded the woman's body before she could react, and that the structure of the crinoline itself made almost impossible to extinguish, because the cage held the burning fabric away from the body in a shape that admitted air and fed the flames. The Lancet, the British medical journal, estimated in 1860 that approximately 3,000 women died by fire in a single year in England. Not all of those deaths were attributable to crinolines, but a substantial proportion were, and the deaths were documented with a regularity that suggests the problem was systemic rather than incidental. In 1871, Mary and Emily Wilde, the half-sisters of Oscar Wilde, attended a Halloween party. While one of the sisters was dancing, her dress caught fire from a candle or a fireplace. The other sister rushed to help her and caught fire herself. Both sisters died from their burns. In 1867, the Archduchess Mathilde of Austria held a cigarette behind her back to conceal it from her father. Her crinoline caught fire. She died of her injuries. In 1861, Fanny Longfellow, the wife of the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, was sitting at a table with her children when a match or a piece of lit paper ignited her dress. She died the following morning. These women did not die because they were careless. They died because they were wearing a garment that was structurally designed to catch fire, and that the fashion industry had introduced into the domestic environment without any consideration of the fact that the domestic environment was heated by open flames. Most of what you have just heard was documented in the coroner's reports, the medical journals, and the chemical analyses of the garments that killed the women who wore them and the workers who made them. If you believe these women deserve to be remembered for what Victorian fashion actually cost them, drop a comment. Tell me what part of this you did not know. Dreadful History Files exists because you keep showing up for the stories that the beautiful surface of the past was designed to hide. Now the corset. Every morning, every day, for decades. The corset did not contain poison. What the corset contained was the body, and what it did to the body over years of daily wear constitutes a category of harm that the fashion industry of the era did not acknowledge, and that the medical establishment of the era debated without resolution. The corset compressed the lower ribs inward, reducing the volume of the chest cavity and the capacity of the lungs. The diaphragm, which requires downward movement to draw air into the lungs, worked against external pressure with every breath. Deep breathing became a negotiation. Full breathing became impossible in a tightly laced corset. The woman who wore one from morning until evening was operating on reduced oxygen for the duration of the wearing, and the duration of the wearing was the duration of her waking day. Fainting was common. Fainting was considered feminine. Fainting was the predictable physiological result of a body operating on restricted oxygen in overheated rooms. But the culture that produced the fainting preferred to attribute it to the delicate constitution of the female nervous system rather than to the garment that was compressing the ribcage of the woman who had just lost consciousness. The internal organs displaced downward over years of corseting. The liver, the stomach, the intestines shifted position under sustained compression, producing digestive problems, constipation, and the chronic abdominal discomfort that Victorian medicine categorized as female complaint and treated with laudanum, which produced dependency, which produced additional symptoms, which the medical establishment treated as evidence of the constitutional weakness it had already diagnosed. The cycle was as tight as the lacing. Now the stockings, the shoes, the dyes beneath the visible surface. Aniline dyes, the synthetic compounds that revolutionized textile coloring in the second half of the 19th century, were celebrated as a triumph of industrial chemistry. William Henry Perkins' discovery of Mauveine in 1856 produced the first synthetic dye, and the explosion of new colors that followed transformed the fashion industry's palette from the limited range of natural dyes to a spectrum that encompassed every shade the human eye could distinguish. The dyes were vivid, they were affordable. They were also, in a number of documented cases, toxic in direct contact with skin. Aniline-dyed stockings and undergarments produced contact dermatitis in wearers whose skin reacted to the chemical compounds. The reactions ranged from mild irritation to severe blistering, and the medical literature of the 1860s and 1870s documented cases with enough frequency to establish that the problem was not idiosyncratic but chemical. The dyes migrated from the fabric to the skin when moisture was present, which meant that the stockings a woman wore on a warm day or during physical activity released their chemical payload into her skin at precisely the moments when her body was producing the sweat that activated the transfer. Now the dressing table. The cosmetics. The final layer. The face powder contained lead. White lead, or ceruse, had been used as a cosmetic since antiquity, and the Victorians inherited both the product and the tradition without inheriting any of the caution that centuries of documented lead poisoning should have instilled. Lead is a cumulative neurotoxin. It does not leave the body efficiently. It accumulates in the bones, the blood, the brain. Chronic exposure produces headaches, fatigue, abdominal pain, cognitive impairment, and in sufficient concentrations, death. The women who applied lead-based face powder every morning were introducing a neurotoxin into their bodies through their skin, daily, for years, and the cosmetic industry that sold the product to them had no legal obligation to disclose its ingredients. Vermilion, the red pigment used in lip color and rouge, contained mercury sulfide. Belladonna, used to dilate the pupils and produce the wide-eyed look that the Victorian beauty standard considered attractive, was extracted from deadly nightshade, a plant whose toxicity was well established and whose cosmetic application required the user to introduce a poison directly into her eyes. Arsenic was sold in pill form as a complexion improver, taken internally on the theory that small doses produced a flush of color in the skin. The theory was correct. The arsenic did produce a flush. The flush was the body's response to being poisoned. She is dressed now. Stand back and look at her. She is beautiful. She is fashionable. She is wearing, from the hat on her head to the stockings on her feet, a combination of mercury, arsenic, lead, aniline compounds, and a structural fire hazard that has been assembled on her body over the course of an hour with the assistance of a lady's maid who did not know what the garments contained and a dressmaker who did not ask. The hat was made by a man losing his mind to mercury. The flowers in her hair were dusted with arsenic by a girl who would be dead within the year. The dress was dyed with a compound that shed 60 grains of poison in an evening of dancing. The crinoline beneath it was a fire trap with no safety mechanism. The corset was compressing her organs and restricting her breathing. The stockings were leaching dye into her skin. The cosmetics on her face contained 3 separate heavy metals, each with its own documented pathway to chronic illness. She looked magnificent. The room told her so. The room was full of women who were identically dressed and identically exposed and identically ignorant of what their clothing contained, because the system that had produced the clothing had not been designed to inform the people who wore it about the chemistry that made it possible. The system had been designed to produce beauty. It had succeeded, and the cost of that success was measured in bodies, not receipts. The Victorian fashion industry did not set out to poison its customers. It set out to provide the colors, the shapes, and the effects that the market demanded, using the materials that industrial chemistry had made available, at the prices that manufacturing scale had made affordable, without any legal requirement to test the safety of the materials before they reached the public, or to disclose their composition after they did. The Pure Food and Drug Act did not pass until 1906. The regulation of arsenic in consumer goods did not arrive in Britain until 1895. The connection between mercury exposure and neurological damage in hat workers was established decades before any legislation addressed it. The knowledge existed, the regulation did not. And in the gap between knowledge and regulation, the wardrobe filled up with garments that looked like luxury and functioned like weapons. The wardrobe is closed now. The items are back on their hangers. The hat on the shelf, the green dress in the center, the crinoline folded beneath it, the corset on its hook, the stockings in their drawer. Everything in its place, everything beautiful, everything precisely as dangerous as it was the morning she opened the wardrobe and began the daily process of putting on what the world expected her to wear without asking what it was made of. Matilda Schorer died at 19. She vomited green. The whites of her eyes turned green. Her fingernails turned green. She died convulsing. foaming, with an expression that the press called great anxiety, which is a phrase that describes the visible surface of a 19-year-old girl dying of arsenic poisoning and says nothing about what it felt like from inside. Mary and Emily Wilde died at a party. Their dresses caught fire. They burned in front of their friends and their family, and the garments that killed them were garments that the fashion industry had sold and the fire safety system had not regulated, and the culture had celebrated as the visible evidence of the femininity it required. The hatters shook. The flower makers convulsed. The women burned. The system continued. The wardrobe was not a wardrobe. It was a cabinet of evidence. Every garment inside it documented a failure of regulation, a failure of disclosure, a failure of the basic principle that the things people put on their bodies should not be capable of killing them. The evidence was beautiful. The evidence was worn to parties and photographed in studios and admired by everyone who saw it and understood by almost nobody who touched it. They deserved to know what they were wearing. The workers deserved to know what they were handling. The flower makers deserved to know what they were breathing. The hatters deserved to know what they were inhaling. And the women who opened their wardrobes every morning and put on the green dress and the mercury hat and the flammable crinoline and the lead powder and the arsenic pills deserved a system that valued their survival as highly as it valued their appearance. They did not get that system. They got the wardrobe, and the wardrobe got them. Subscribe to Dreadful History Files. The past was not what they told you it was. And the next story is already hanging in a closet you thought you knew, waiting to be examined in a light the fashion industry never intended you to see.